In the 1960s, Bob Crane was living the dream. He had a perfect smile, razor-sharp timing, and a reputation as one of the most likable men in show business. Audiences fell in love with him as Colonel Robert Hogan, the clever and charismatic lead on Hogan's Heroes, a sitcom set in a German prisoner of war camp during World War II. The premise was strange, even risky, but Bob Crane made it work. With his quick wit and undeniable charm, he turned the show into a cultural phenomenon. Before television stardom, Crane had already carved out a name for himself on the radio. He was known as the Man of 1,000 Voices in Los Angeles, hosting a wildly popular morning show that mixed celebrity interviews, drumming performances, and rapid-fire comedy bits. He was considered a master of improvisation, and his natural confidence made him a favorite among Hollywood elites. Even Walt Disney once called him the fastest wit in the West. When Hogan's Heroes premiered in 1965, Bob Crane quickly became a household name. The show ran for 6 seasons and attracted millions of viewers. Crane was nominated for 2 Emmy Awards, and his face was everywhere, from billboards to lunchboxes. He had what many actors only dreamed of: money, recognition, and creative control. To the outside world, Bob Crane was riding high on a wave of unstoppable success. But beneath the polished surface, something darker was beginning to form. Those who worked closely with him noticed subtle changes. His relationships became more strained. His need for excitement started bleeding into risky behavior. And yet, none of it made headlines. At least, not yet. Because while Bob Crane was making people laugh on camera, off camera, he was descending into something far more disturbing. Something he thought he could keep hidden forever. But that would soon change. As Hogan's Heroes climbed the ratings, Bob Crane was building a second life, one that no one on set ever saw. To the public, he was the affable Colonel Hogan, cracking jokes and outsmarting the enemy with a grin. But when the cameras stopped rolling, Crane was chasing something very different. Behind closed doors, he had developed an obsession, one that would not just derail his career, but cast a permanent shadow over his legacy. It started subtly. While still hosting radio shows in Los Angeles, Crane developed a fascination with photography, but not just artistic stills or portraits. He became interested in filming his private encounters with women. Some were brief flings, others were relationships. Many of the women involved did not even know they were being recorded, and for Bob Crane, the camera was not just a prop. It became the centerpiece of his life off-camera. Then came John Henry Carpenter, a video equipment salesman and technician who worked with major television studios. Crane and Carpenter met in the mid-1960s and quickly bonded over their shared interest in photography and emerging video technology. But Carpenter brought more than just equipment. He introduced Crane to new gadgets, gave him access to hotel setups, and, according to several accounts, actively helped arrange encounters with women. The two became inseparable, often traveling together, staying in the same hotels, and documenting what went on behind those doors. While some acquaintances thought it was just harmless fun between two bachelors, others were disturbed. Crane's charisma masked something far more compulsive. He was living 2 entirely separate lives, and the lines between them were beginning to blur. As Crane's addiction escalated, so did the strain on his personal life. His marriage fell apart. His professional reputation started to suffer. Co-stars described a man who was increasingly distracted, increasingly erratic, and obsessed with filming every aspect of his private escapades. But Crane insisted it was all under control. Then, in 1978, just as he was trying to rebuild his life with stage work and a second marriage, Bob Crane was found bludgeoned in his apartment. The room showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing was stolen. And the only other person with regular access to that apartment was John Carpenter. But that was only the beginning. June 29, 1978. Scottsdale, Arizona. The brutal discovery came just after noon. When a theater colleague could not reach Bob Crane by phone, he went to check on him at the Winfield Place Apartments, where Crane had been staying during a stage run of Beginner's Luck. What he found inside Unit 132A would become one of the most baffling and disturbing crime scenes in Hollywood history. Bob Crane was lying motionless in bed. The weapon used had left deep lacerations in his skull, too forceful, too personal. He had been struck repeatedly, likely while he slept, and a twisted electrical cord was loosely tied around his neck. But strangely, nothing else in the room was disturbed. There was no sign of forced entry, no valuables missing, no evidence of a robbery gone wrong. What investigators did find, though, raised immediate red flags. Video cameras, tripods, cables, tapes, dozens of them, all detailing Crane's private life in explicit detail. It was clear that this was not a random break-in. Whoever had done this knew him, knew his habits, and may have even been watching. There were no defensive wounds. That suggested Bob had either been asleep or he trusted the person enough to let them in without hesitation. One of the last people to see him alive was John Carpenter, who had flown in from Los Angeles to visit Crane just days earlier. The two had dinner the night before the murder. They even watched some of their home videos together. According to Carpenter, everything seemed fine when he left, but the Scottsdale police were not so sure. They immediately saw Carpenter as a person of interest. He had access. He had motive, jealousy, resentment, maybe something deeper. And most damning of all, a witness claimed that Crane had tried to end the friendship just days before his death. Investigators brought Carpenter in for questioning, but without a weapon, without fingerprints, and without a clear timeline, the case stalled. The only tangible evidence linking Carpenter to the crime scene came from something almost invisible, small traces found in a rental car. And yet, that would not come into focus for nearly 2 decades. Because for years, the case went cold. The tapes were boxed up, the files were shelved. Became just another unsolved Hollywood tragedy. Until new technology and a second look at that car changed everything. John Henry Carpenter was not a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was a close friend of Bob Crane's, perhaps his closest. The two had spent years traveling together, filming together, living out a lifestyle that few in Crane's inner circle truly understood. But when the police began peeling back the layers of Carpenter's name kept coming up, and the more they looked, the more they found reasons to be suspicious. Carpenter worked for Sony, supplying emerging video technology to television stars. Through that role, he became the man who helped Bob Crane document everything. But their bond, once rooted in a shared obsession, had started to fracture. Crane was reportedly growing tired of the arrangement. He wanted to change, to settle down. He had recently remarried and was attempting to distance himself from the lifestyle that had consumed him for so long. Several friends later recalled that Crane had told Carpenter their friendship was over. That revelation took on a new weight once investigators reviewed Carpenter's trip to Scottsdale. He had flown in to spend time with Crane, stayed nearby, and was seen on multiple occasions in the days leading up. The night before Crane's death, they had dinner together. They returned to Crane's apartment. They watched tapes. Then, according to Carpenter, he went back to his own motel. But there were problems with his story. First, a hotel employee remembered seeing Carpenter return late, much later than he claimed. Then, there was the rental car. The police found a smear on the passenger door. Inside the car, they discovered tissue fragments, small but potentially crucial, and Carpenter could not explain how they got there. Still, in 1978, forensic tools were limited. There was no way to match the biological material definitively to Bob Crane. And despite mounting suspicions, no charges were filed. The evidence was circumstantial. No murder weapon had been found, no fingerprints tied Carpenter to the scene. So, he walked free. But he did not walk away from the spotlight. Carpenter gave interviews, denied everything, and claimed the whole situation was being twisted by sensationalists. In the court of public opinion, though, he was already guilty. His name would forever be linked to Crane's death. What investigators did not know at the time was that science would soon catch up, and when it did, the case would explode back into the headlines. By the early 1990s, Bob Crane's murder had become a ghost story in Hollywood circles, a chilling, unresolved case that left more questions than answers. But in Scottsdale, the police never let it go. They knew something had been missed. And with advancements in forensic science finally catching up, they saw an opportunity to revisit the evidence that had haunted them for years. At the center of their renewed investigation was one item: the rental car John Carpenter had used during his stay in Arizona. Back in 1978, detectives had collected biological material from inside the vehicle, small amounts of tissue, and a faint smear of blood. At the time, there was no way to determine where it came from. But now, nearly 2 decades later, the department called in experts from a new field: DNA analysis. The results were not crystal clear, but they were suggestive enough to reopen the case. A partial DNA match indicated that the tissue fragments could very likely have come from Bob Crane. And while it was not the smoking gun prosecutors had hoped for, it was enough to put John Carpenter back in the spotlight, this time as a defendant. In June 1994, Carpenter was arrested and charged with the murder of Bob Crane. The news sent shockwaves through the entertainment world. For years, Carpenter had managed to live in relative obscurity. Now, reporters camped outside his home, digging through his past and splashing his face across every tabloid in the country. The case was a prosecutor's nightmare. There were no eyewitnesses. The murder weapon had never been recovered. The DNA evidence, though compelling, was not conclusive. And because the original crime scene had been contaminated and poorly preserved, there was no clean chain of custody for most of the physical evidence. Still, prosecutors pushed forward. They believed motive was key: Carpenter's jealousy, his rejection by Crane, and his possible desperation as his access to Crane's world began to vanish. They argued that Carpenter, feeling discarded and humiliated, struck out in a fit of rage. The defense, however, painted a different picture. They claimed the evidence was flimsy, the DNA far too degraded to be reliable, and the motive purely speculative. In the courtroom, the trial played out like a made-for-television drama. The prosecution showed graphic photos, played audio of Crane's private recordings, and laid bare the strange double life he had led. But in doing so, they also revealed something they had not intended: the full extent of Crane's secret obsessions. The jury was not just deciding whether Carpenter was guilty. They were being asked to wade through a web of addiction, exploitation, and betrayal. In 1995, after weeks of testimony, the jury reached a decision. John Carpenter was acquitted. The case, once again, went cold. But one person was not ready to let it go. While the courtroom lights dimmed and the headlines faded, one person refused to move on. Bob Crane's oldest son, Robert Crane Jr., had grown up watching his father entertain millions, and then watched that image be shattered. The murder, the tapes, the trial. It had all been a public spectacle. But for Robert, it was personal, and he was not convinced the story was over. In the years after the acquittal, Robert began his own search for answers. He reviewed old police files, spoke with investigators, and revisited the people who had known his father best. What he found disturbed him: sloppy evidence handling, missed timelines, crucial details that were overlooked or ignored. And most of all, he remained haunted by the man who had once called his father his best friend, John Carpenter. To Robert, Carpenter was more than just a suspect. He was the last link in a chain of secrecy and manipulation that had taken everything from their family. In interviews, Robert was blunt. He believed Carpenter was guilty, no matter what the jury had said. And he believed the justice system had failed. But Robert's mission was not just about blame. It was about reclaiming the story of who Bob Crane really was. In 2015, he published a memoir, Crane, Sex, Celebrity, and My Father's Unsolved Murder, in which he told the story not just of the crime, but of the man behind the smile. A complex man, a flawed man, someone who, beneath the charm and humor, was fighting demons few ever saw. Robert spoke candidly about his father's addictions, his compulsions, and the way fame had created an illusion that slowly unraveled. He did not sugarcoat it, but he did offer something that had been missing from every news article and tabloid: context. Bob Crane had been trying to pull himself out of that world. He had been trying to change. He had even taken steps to cut ties with Carpenter just days before his death. And that detail, one that came from a private letter Bob wrote shortly before he was killed, haunted Robert more than any photograph or courtroom transcript. It painted a clear emotional picture. Bob Crane was not just murdered. He was betrayed. Robert spent decades trying to make sense of it all. But no matter how much he uncovered, one truth remained. The justice system had let his father down, and the world would probably never know the full truth. But what disturbed Robert the most was not the mystery of who had done it. It was how easily the world had moved on. The audience that once adored Bob Crane had turned away when things got messy. They remembered the scandal, not the talent. They remembered the trial, not the years of laughter and creativity that came before. And so, Robert Crane Jr. did what the courts could not. He told the whole story, ugly, unfiltered, and human. Bob Crane's story is often reduced to headlines and speculation. A television star with a dark secret, a mysterious death, a friend turned suspect. But the truth is far more unsettling and far more human. His life was not a simple rise and fall. It was a slow unraveling, one tangled in loneliness, addiction, and the unbearable weight of fame. Crane had spent years making people laugh. He was the centerpiece of a hit show, the life of every room he walked into. But when the cameras stopped, he was someone else entirely. Off stage, he was battling an addiction that consumed his personal life and blurred every boundary. The lines between intimacy and performance, between friendship and exploitation, became harder and harder to define. And by the time he tried to escape it, it was already too late. What makes his story especially tragic is how it was remembered. For many, Bob Crane is not the brilliant improviser or the Emmy-nominated actor. He is the man from the headlines, the tapes, the unsolved murder. Decades of hard work and laughter were drowned out by scandal. And because his case was never solved, it became a kind of spectacle, something people whispered about, speculated over, and ultimately forgot. Even his professional legacy suffered. Hogan's Heroes, once one of the most popular shows in the United States, is rarely mentioned without a footnote about Crane's death. Directors avoided discussing his name. Networks quietly stopped rerunning his episodes. It was as if Hollywood itself wanted to bury him along with the case, not because they did not care, but because they did not want to look too closely at what his life revealed. Bob Crane's story forced the entertainment industry to confront something uncomfortable, that beneath the bright lights and applause, many performers were silently unraveling. Crane was not alone in his struggles. He was just the one who got caught in the middle of them. Fame had given him everything, but it also created an illusion that left him isolated. His darkest habits were enabled, his cries for help ignored, and his final moments still unanswered. Even today, when crime podcasts revisit the story or television specials bring it back into the spotlight, they focus on the whodunit. But the real question is not just who killed Bob Crane. It is why he was vulnerable in the first place. Why someone so admired and successful was also so profoundly lost. And why, in the end, no one stepped in before it was too late. The Bob Crane mystery might never be solved in court, but in the quiet pages of his son's book, in the files of persistent detectives, and in the questions that still linger in the minds of fans, there is a different kind of truth. One that exposes not just a killer, but a system that failed to see the warning signs. Bob Crane was not just the smiling face of a classic sitcom. He was a man struggling to reconcile who he was with who the world wanted him to be. On screen, he played the hero. Off screen, he fell into a world that was darker and more isolating than anyone around him could fully grasp. His sudden and brutal death shocked a nation, but it also revealed how little we truly know about the people we admire. For decades, the mystery surrounding his murder overshadowed everything else. And as the case grew colder, so did the public's memory of his talent, his wit, and the charm that once made him one of television's brightest stars. The focus shifted entirely to the scandal, to the tapes, to the trial, to the unanswered questions that kept people guessing. But underneath that intrigue was a man who lost control and who paid the ultimate price for a life that spiraled in silence. Even today, the name Bob Crane sparks curiosity, but rarely compassion. He became a symbol of unsolved tragedy, of private shame made public. Yet his story is not just about what happened in that apartment in Scottsdale. It is about the warning signs ignored, the struggles hidden behind fame, and the consequences of turning a blind eye. Justice was never served in court, but maybe By remembering him in full, not just as a headline, not just as a victim, we can start to see the real legacy Bob Crane left behind. A legacy that demands we look deeper, ask harder questions,